Next segment, Garrett Graff, author of, again, Raven Rock, the story of the U.S. government's secret plan to save itself while the rest of us die. So we talk the Cold War, myths and folklore and urban legends about bunkers and survival. How many of these secret bunkers are there? Where are they? Was Walter Cronkite and others, did they have a secret beeper they carried on their person and they would be shepherded away by helicopter or speedboat or car in the event of a nuclear war? Did the United States government and other elites, did they actually believe you could win a nuclear war? That it was survivable? And how the heck, as I said, Garrett just sort of fell down the rabbit hole. He's a hell of a writer, hell of a researcher. And the way that he sort of discovered Raven Rock. So next segment, the one and only Garrett Graff here on the Chauncey DeVega Show.
So throw your coat down on the pile. There's no room on the rack. So throw your coat down on the pile. Yeah, we joke around all day long, but when night time comes, we joke around some more. Just throw your coat on the pile and get yourself out on the wall. Just throw your coat on the pile.
Thinking about how do we explain to millennials and others that sort of existential threat, because I remember, talking to my mother was 20 or so during the Cuban Missile Crisis, but even in the 80s into the Cold War, going to bed and praying that the world wasn't annihilated in a nuclear holocaust and trying to explain that sort of generational or really existential angst to folks of a different generation. I mean, when you go out there and talk to folks, how do you broach that conversation? Thinking literally, I'm here in Chicago and they had the nuclear tipped Nike missiles out here at the point. The theory being that they could shoot down mass bomber formations. Or you're there in Burlington, Vermont, and you had these ready alert fighters that were likely armed with nuclear missiles as well.
It's a good question, and I think it's actually a really interesting part of the research for me. I do think one of the hard things about trying to discuss the Cold War today is the extent to which you can't really capture that existential dread that existed during certainly the peak of the Cold War. And part because we know how the Cold War ends. I mean, we know that we win relatively easily, relatively peacefully, and we now know with the benefit of history that the Soviet Union was never actually as strong as we thought it was, both economically and militarily. I think there is a good bit of this very hard to recapture. And that was part of what I was interested in doing with the book. But then also, frankly, I was even surprised in the course of the book about just how weird these plans were, just how extensive the planning was. I mean, the idea that there were these national exercises, these Operation Alerts or these other large-scale exercises that saw whole cities evacuate, saw New York City shut down, and people rush to fallout shelters. It's really strange to imagine today.
In your research, did you discover any other moments besides, I think, the three that we know about, where we were literally, a minute or 2 or 5 minutes from nuclear war? We know how the story ended, so it's hard to sort of convey that anxiety because we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, you had the Able Archer, was at 83, you had that moment under Yeltsin. But were there any other moments?
Well, two of the most famous ones were actually what happened during the Carter administration with basically computer problems at NORAD that became the basis for the movie WarGames later with Matthew Broderick, a computer starting World War III semi by accident. And that there was some reality to that. The big Brzezinski was in fact awoken in the middle of the night and told that there were thousands of Soviet nuclear missiles on the way to the United States because of a computer error. And, luckily all of that stuff was sorted out before anyone on our side came towards actually launching nuclear weapons. But there was no guarantee. And I think that there were plenty of opportunities along the way that saw policy leaders confronted with events that very possibly could have ended up in nuclear war.
And of course, all things in this moment revolve around Donald Trump. But they had a really, really powerful piece. I think it was on This American Life about a month or so ago. They're trying to explore the ethical and moral dimensions of leadership in nuclear war and saying, would you turn the key if you felt that the president or that it was mentally or insane or just acting irresponsibly? And they actually ended up, he must be in his 80s now, interviewing this young man. He was in Vietnam. He was a helicopter pilot, then went on to missile training. And in the final stages of his training, they had all the questions about would you launch? And he starts asking questions about different scenarios, and they basically drummed him out of the Air Force because of it. And then another piece came out, I think, about 4 or 5 months ago, again, on the same question about, does the president have too much authority, especially in terms of legitimacy in this moment? But they're also talking about Nixon, and these stories about Nixon ranting and raving and ordering the bombers to be launched and these drunken tirades in the middle of the night. What is your take on this?
Some of this is necessary to understand the context of which these systems were created during the Cold War. Were in the guise of speeding up the process. They were built to strip away the checks and balances that might hinder the response time. You were talking about incredibly brief windows, and you were talking about incredibly brief windows during eras of pretty imperfect technology. So the idea that, well, you need to reach 3 different people on the phone and they all need to say yes, or get everyone into a video teleconference, was just not realistic, given what you were looking at were 10, 12, 15, 20-minute windows, particularly given that probably take the military 3-4 minutes to decide that a launch was real. And so then you were talking about 6 minutes. You were talking about 8 minutes of time for the president to respond. We built a very good and successful system in that it was able to operate on, at its best at least, on a hair trigger alert and allow the president, once he authenticated that he was the president, to launch the missiles very, very quickly. And that is something that I think we today don't necessarily need insofar as really on hair trigger alert anymore. And perhaps there is a better system that we could come up with that would involve a check or balance, involve the Secretary of State giving a sign-off, involve the Speaker of the House giving a sign-off, or sort of something like that.
Was it under Clinton or Obama that launch on warning, was it basically stopped, or was it altered? So now the submarines, basically, if they don't get a communication, they would fire. But the idea of having, ready alert intercontinental bombers or having the command and control aircraft in the sky at all times. What's the status now?
What you have seen is that we have many fewer deployed missiles and nuclear weapons today, which is all part of the Arms Reduction Treaty. You see a fair bit of public debate now about, do we need to have a different set of protocols and systems for the era of peacetime that we now mostly find ourselves living in, particularly because what you are likely facing today is a more complicated threat